November 27th, 2026. That's the date circled in red on every supply chain manager's calendar from Tokyo to Seoul to Taipei. It's the day China's rare earth export truce with the United States expires. And exactly 1 month from today, on May 14th, Donald Trump will fly to Beijing for his first visit to China in 8 years to meet Xi Jinping and try to extend it.
I was just reading about this timeline, and honestly, the stakes are hard to overstate. China controls 69% of global rare earth mining and 92% of rare earth processing. In January, they flat-out banned dual-use exports to Japan, and Japan gets 63% of its rare earth imports from China, 85% of its gallium, which is essential for 5G chips and defense electronics.
And the economic impact of those restrictions is already quantifiable. Nomura Research Institute estimates that if the rare earth restrictions against Japan last 3 months, Japan would lose about 660 billion yen, roughly $4.2 billion. After 1 year, losses could reach 2.6 trillion yen, which would dent GDP by 0.43%. That's not theoretical. That's a ticking clock.
So walk me through how we got to this moment, because the trade war has gone through so many phases, it's hard to keep track.
Sure. Let's rewind. In April 2025, Trump launched the so-called Liberation Day tariffs under IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Both sides escalated tariffs beyond 100% on each other. China retaliated by restricting U.S. access to rare earth magnets, gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite, things that the United States literally cannot get anywhere else at scale.
And then came the Supreme Court ruling in February 2026.
Right, that was a bombshell. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that IEEPA does not authorize tariffs. The case was Learning Resources versus Trump. This effectively killed the legal basis for the original tariffs. So the administration pivoted to Section 122, which allows a temporary 10% tariff for 150 days to address trade imbalances. That 150-day clock runs out on July 24th.
Wait, so there are 2 deadlines? July 24th for the tariffs and November 27th for the rare earth truce?
Exactly. And there's a third. The USTR launched new Section 301 investigations on March 11th into structural excess capacity in manufacturing across 16 countries, including China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and India. The target completion date for those investigations is also July 24th. So you've got a triple convergence: tariff authority expiring, new trade investigations concluding, and the rare earth truce clock ticking. All of this is the backdrop for the May summit.
And the Busan meeting last October is what created the current truce, right?
Correct. Trump and Xi met in Busan, South Korea on October 30th, 2025. They agreed to walk back some of the most extreme measures. China issued what the White House calls a general license for exports of rare earths, gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite to the U.S., valid through November 27th, 2026. In exchange, the U.S. scaled back some tariffs, and Trump told American farmers that $40 billion in soybeans would be shipped to China.
So what's actually on the table for the May 14th summit? What can Trump and Xi realistically agree on?
There are 3 main negotiating tracks. First, trade volumes. The soybean deal is the headline number. $40 billion in U.S. agricultural exports to China is significant. It's essentially Trump's pitch to the farm states ahead of the midterm elections. China gets to show cooperation, the U.S. gets export numbers, everybody saves face.
But that's the easy part, right? The hard stuff is technology.
Exactly. The second track is semiconductors and AI. Beijing's top priority is getting Washington to loosen export controls on advanced chips and AI technology. Remember, the U.S. has been tightening semiconductor controls for years now. Huawei can't access advanced nodes from TSMC. Chinese companies are building their own AI chip stacks with Ascend processors on SMIC's 5-nanometer equivalent process, but they'd much rather have access to NVIDIA's latest GPUs legally.
And the U.S. has leverage there because China still needs those chips for training large AI models, even as their inference capabilities have improved dramatically with things like DeepSeek.
Right. And the third track, which is the most structurally important, is the proposed Board of Trade mechanism. The U.S. and China are working on creating a permanent bilateral framework that would define what the 2 countries can sustainably trade without crossing national security red lines. If this actually gets established, it would be the first formalized trade architecture between the 2 largest economies since before the trade war began.
Now let's talk about the ripple effects across Asia, because this isn't just a U.S.-China story. The Section 301 investigations that launched in March target 16 countries: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, India, and more.
And the timing is brutal for Asia. USTR Jameson Greer has been explicit that these investigations could lead to tariffs by July 24th. Current rates are already significant: 35% on China, 15% on Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, 20% on Vietnam, 18% on India. If Section 301 investigations result in additional targeted tariffs on top of those, the impact on Asian manufacturing and exports could be severe.
Japan is in a particularly awkward position. China banned rare earth exports to Japan in January after Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba made comments about Taiwan. So Japan has caught between U.S. pressure on chip export controls and Chinese pressure on raw material access.
That's the geopolitical sandwich that every Asian economy is trying to navigate. You need American technology and Chinese materials. Picking a side isn't an option. And the numbers show why. Japan imports 85% of its gallium from China. There are alternative suppliers in Germany and Kazakhstan, but they operate at significantly smaller scales and cannot replace Chinese production volumes in the near term.
What about the ASEAN countries? Vietnam and Thailand have been the biggest beneficiaries of the China Plus One strategy, but now they're also under Section 301 investigation.
That's the irony. Countries that attracted manufacturing away from China are now being investigated for the same kind of excess capacity concerns. Vietnam's electronics exports surged past $107 billion in 2025 precisely because companies like Samsung and Apple moved production there. But from USTR's perspective, that's still part of a supply chain that originates in Chinese industrial policy. The investigation looks at whether these countries are benefiting from non-market practices that create structural overcapacity.
So even the China Plus One winners might get caught in the crossfire.
That's the risk, and it's why the May summit matters so much for all of Asia, not just for U.S.-China bilateral relations. Contrarian corner. The consensus view is that the May summit is a high-stakes showdown that will determine the trajectory of U.S.-China relations for the next 2 years. I think the summit itself is almost irrelevant.
Okay, that's a bold take. Why?
5 charts that Invez published in March tell the story. Despite all the tariff drama, despite the Supreme Court ruling, despite the rare earth restrictions, trade between the U.S. and China has barely budged in structural terms. Chinese goods are still flowing to American consumers, just through different channels. Vietnam, Mexico, and other intermediary countries are processing and relabeling Chinese components. The tariffs are a tax on American consumers, not a barrier to Chinese exports.
So you're saying the trade war is theater?
I'm saying the bilateral trade numbers don't change as much as the headlines suggest. What changes is the routing. And here's the contrarian insight. Both sides know this. Trump needs a win to show farmers before the midterms. Xi needs stability to manage China's property crisis and deflationary pressure. The summit will produce a deal not because they've resolved their differences, but because both leaders need a photo op.
But the rare earth leverage is real. You can't route around gallium and germanium the way you can route around tariffs.
That's fair, and it's the one area where China has genuine structural power. But even there, the picture is changing. The U.S. Department of Defense is investing in alternative rare earth processing capacity. Australia's Lynas Rare Earths is expanding. MP Materials in California is ramping up. The question is timeline. These alternatives need 3 to 5 years to reach meaningful scale. In the meantime, yes, China has a chokehold.
And what about the impact on Asia's tech supply chain specifically? Because semiconductor companies in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan are caught in the middle.
Here's what I think most people are missing. The real structural shift isn't happening at the summit table. It's happening in corporate boardrooms across Asia. Tokyo Electron, which gets 43% of its revenue from China, is already diversifying its customer base. Samsung is hedging its foundry bets between Texas and Korea. TSMC is building in Arizona, but keeping its most advanced nodes on the island. These decisions are being made regardless of what Trump and Xi shake hands on in May.
That's actually a really important point. The corporate response to geopolitical uncertainty has become more sophisticated than the policy itself.
Exactly, and the data supports this. ASEAN plus China trade hit record levels in 2025 despite the tariff war. The RCEP free trade agreement is deepening intra-Asian trade connections. Asia is quietly building a parallel trade architecture that's less dependent on U.S.-China bilateral agreements.
So your actual contrarian take is that Asia is decoupling from the U.S.-China dynamic, not from each other.
That's precisely it. The conventional wisdom says the world is splitting into 2 blocks, U.S.-aligned and China-aligned. But what's actually happening is that Asian economies are building a third path, deeper integration with each other while maintaining transactional relationships with both superpowers. Singapore, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, they're all playing this game, and they're getting better at it.
But doesn't the November 27th rare earth deadline still create a genuine crisis point? If the truce expires and China doesn't renew it, gallium and germanium supplies to the entire Western semiconductor industry gets choked.
That's the key risk, and it's why the summit matters tactically even if it doesn't matter strategically. Both sides need to extend the truce, or at least create a framework for extending it. The Board of Trade mechanism being discussed is the vehicle for that. If it gets established in May, it provides a permanent negotiating channel that reduces the risk of sudden cutoffs.
All right, action items. What should people actually be watching?
Action item number 1. The May 14th to 15th Summit Communique language on rare earth minerals. Forget the soybeans, forget the photo ops. The single most important outcome is whether the rare earth general license gets extended past November 27th, or better yet, made permanent through the Board of Trade mechanism. If the communique uses language like mutual commitment to stable critical mineral supply or establishes a formal bilateral mineral trading framework, that's bullish for the entire Asian semiconductor and defense supply chain. If it's vague or deferred, start pricing in disruption risk for Q4.
And the specific materials to watch are gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite, right?
Exactly. Gallium is the most critical because there are very few alternative sources at scale. The price of gallium doubled from about $1,000 to $2,000 per kilogram during the last export restriction period. If restrictions resume, that price could spike further, directly impacting 5G equipment costs, defense electronics, and advanced chip production across Japan, Korea, and Taiwan.
Action item number 2.
Track the July 24th convergence point. 3 things happen around that date. Section 122 temporary tariffs expire. Section 301 investigations against 16 countries reach their target completion, and USTR must decide on new tariff actions. This is the moment when the current tariff architecture either gets replaced with a more permanent structure or creates a policy vacuum. The outcomes for each of those 16 countries, especially Vietnam, Thailand, Japan, and Korea, will reshape manufacturing location decisions for the next decade.
I'd flag that companies are already making preemptive moves. Apple's India production ramp, Samsung's Vietnam expansion, these aren't reactions to tariff outcomes. They're hedges against tariff uncertainty.
Great point. The uncertainty itself is driving structural changes in supply chains, regardless of the actual policy outcome.
And action item number 3?
Watch the ASEAN-China trade data. If intra-Asian trade continues to accelerate, hitting new records despite the U.S. tariff environment, that confirms the thesis that Asia is building a parallel trading system. The RCEP framework, bilateral currency swap agreements, and direct settlement mechanisms between Asian central banks are all reducing dependence on dollar-denominated trade. The data on this comes quarterly, and the Q126 numbers should be published in May, right around the summit.
The big picture takeaway is that this isn't just a US-China story. It's about whether the global trade system fractures into competing blocs, or whether Asia manages to maintain connections to both sides. The May summit is a bellwether, not because of what Trump and Xi agree on, but because of how every other Asian economy positions itself in response.
And the clock is ticking. July 24th for tariffs, November 27th for rare earths. The decisions made in the next 6 months will determine the shape of Asian trade for the next decade.
Coming up next, we're going to break down Sea Group's quiet domination of Southeast Asian e-commerce. While everyone's watching the Grab-Goto merger drama, Shopee just posted $23 billion in revenue and 400 million active buyers.
That's going to be a good one. The company nobody talks about that's winning everything.
And if you want the written version with all the data and sources, we publish a free daily newsletter at asiatechmacro.substack.com. Today's piece includes the full tariff timeline, the rare earth supply chain map, and the Section 301 investigation tracker.
Essential reading. All right, that's it for today. Stay data-driven. Bye.